Imagine a mother's worst nightmare multiplied by 4. This was the reality for Kathleen Folbigg. She was a young woman who, over 10 years, lost each of her 4 babies. One by one, they slipped away, leaving behind a silence that echoed with grief and confusion. Her first child, Caleb, lived for just 19 days. Then came Patrick, followed by Sarah, and finally Laura. Each death was sudden, unexplained, and devastating. The family doctor noted the tragedies as sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. But as the losses mounted, a dark cloud of suspicion began to form. Was this a string of terrible misfortunes, or was something more sinister at play? The question hung heavy in the air, waiting for an answer. This personal tragedy soon spiraled into a public spectacle. The police investigation began to focus on the one person present at every death, the mother. Kathleen Folbigg found herself at the center of an unimaginable storm. Investigators began to scrutinize her every action, her every word, looking for a sign of guilt. They saw a woman who did not grieve in the way they expected. They saw a pattern not of medical anomaly, but of criminal intent. The narrative shifted from a story of a grieving parent to one of a monstrous killer. For Kathleen, the nightmare was just beginning. She was no longer just a mother who had lost her children. She was now Australia's most hated woman. The accusation was shocking in its simplicity and its horror. The prosecution alleged that she had smothered each of her 4 children. This was a crime so unnatural, so contrary to the instincts of motherhood, that it captivated and horrified the nation. There was no direct physical evidence of smothering, no bruises, no marks, no witnesses. The case would be built on circumstantial evidence, on interpretations, and on the words Kathleen herself had written in her private diaries. Her grief, her frustration, her darkest thoughts, all would be twisted into a confession. The story became less about what happened and more about who Kathleen Folbigg was perceived to be. For the public, the idea of a mother killing her own children was almost too much to bear. It tapped into our deepest fears about parenthood and trust. The story was simple to understand, even if it was hard to believe. A mother, one by one, took the lives of her babies. The alternative, that a single family could suffer such an incredible series of genetic tragedies, seemed far less likely. And so the stage was set for one of Australia's most contentious legal battles. A grieving mother was about to be put on trial, not just in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, where the verdict had already been decided long before the evidence was heard. The Folbigg family's story began with hope, like any other. Kathleen and her husband Craig welcomed their first son, Caleb, in 1989, but their joy was short-lived. Just 19 days later, Caleb died. The official cause was listed as SIDS, a diagnosis that offered no real answers, only a label for an unexplained tragedy. The couple was devastated, but they tried to move forward. They held on to the hope of building the family they had always dreamed of. Grief was a heavy blanket, but they believed they could find their way through it. The loss of a child is an unimaginable pain, and for the Folbiggs, it was only the beginning of a long and dark road. Less than 2 years later, in 1991, their second son, Patrick, was born. For 8 months, he was a source of light in their lives. But then, tragedy struck again. Patrick suffered a seizure and was left with brain damage. He passed away in his sleep. Once again, the family was plunged into mourning. 2 children lost in 2 years. Friends and family rallied around them, but whispers of bad luck began to follow the couple. The medical examiner noted epilepsy as a contributing factor, but the shadow of SIDS still lingered. The randomness of it all was baffling. The pain was immense, and the lack of clear answers only made it worse for a mother trying to understand why this was happening. In 1993, Sarah was born. She was a healthy, happy baby, and for a short time it seemed the curse had been lifted. But at 10 months old, Sarah also died in her cot. The cause was again determined to be SIDS. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 children, all dead before their first birthday. The authorities began to take a closer look. While SIDS can run in families, 3 deaths was highly unusual. The medical community was divided. Was this an unlucky family with a genetic predisposition to sudden infant death? Or was something else going on? The weight of suspicion started to shift squarely onto Kathleen's shoulders. The final tragedy occurred in 1999. Laura, the Folbigg's 4th child, died at 18 months old. Unlike her siblings, Laura had been a healthy toddler. Her death was the one that tipped the scales from suspicion to a full-blown criminal investigation. Leading medical experts of the time believed that 4 infant deaths in one family were not a coincidence. The famous and now discredited Meadows Law was cited: 1 sudden infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder unless proved otherwise. With Laura's death, the police were convinced they had their proof. Kathleen Folbigg was arrested, charged with the murder of 3 of her children and the manslaughter of 1. At the heart of the prosecution's case against Kathleen Folbigg were her personal diaries. These were not public documents, they were private journals where she poured out her frustrations, her fears, and her overwhelming grief. For years, she had documented the struggles of motherhood. She wrote about her exhaustion, her feelings of inadequacy, and her moments of anger. These were the raw, unfiltered thoughts of a woman under immense stress, dealing with the loss of one child after another. She questioned her own sanity and her ability to be a good mother. To Kathleen, this was a way to cope, a safe space to express feelings she felt she could not share with anyone else. However, in the hands of prosecutors, these diaries were transformed into a weapon. They cherry-picked phrases and sentences, stripping them of their context. An entry where Kathleen wrote about Sarah. She's a fairly good-natured baby, thank goodness. It has saved her from the fate of her siblings. I think she was warned, was presented as a chilling confession. Another entry, I am my father's daughter, was used to link her to her father, who had killed her mother. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating woman who was documenting her crimes. The jury was told that these were not the words of a grieving mother, but of a methodical killer. The interpretation of these diary entries was deeply problematic. The prosecution ignored entries where Kathleen expressed deep love and affection for her children. They overlooked passages where she wrote about her profound sadness and her desperate search for answers. For example, after one child's death, she wrote about the Black Depression that consumed her, but these expressions of mental anguish were not seen as signs of grief. Instead, they were framed as evidence of guilt, as if a good mother would never admit to feeling stressed or resentful. The complexity of human emotion was flattened into a simple, damning narrative. This use of her diaries highlights a dangerous aspect of the justice system. It shows how subjective interpretation can be presented as objective fact. A psychologist for the prosecution testified that the diaries showed a lack of maternal feeling, yet other experts could have easily interpreted the same words as classic signs of depression and post-traumatic stress. The jury, comprised of ordinary people, was left to decide which interpretation was correct. Faced with the emotional weight of 4 dead children and the seemingly incriminating words from the mother herself, they were led down a path that pointed to only one conclusion: guilt. Her private thoughts had been turned against her. Long before Kathleen Folbigg stepped into a courtroom, she was tried and convicted by the media. The story was sensational. A mother accused of killing her 4 babies. It was a headline that sold newspapers and kept viewers glued to their screens. The media coverage was relentless and often one-sided. Details from her diaries were leaked to the press, presented without context, and framed in the most sinister light possible. Headlines screamed about the baby killer and Australia's worst female serial killer. These labels stuck, creating a public perception that was almost impossible to reverse. The public was outraged, and that anger was directed squarely at Kathleen. This intense media scrutiny had a profound impact on the legal process. It created an environment where it was difficult for anyone involved to remain impartial. Potential jurors were exposed to a barrage of negative information about Folbigg before the trial even began. The narrative was set: she was a monster. This made the presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of our justice system, incredibly fragile. The media's portrayal shaped public opinion so powerfully that it created an expectation of a guilty verdict. Anything less would have seemed like a failure of justice to a public that had already made up its mind based on the sensationalized reports they had consumed. The media also simplified a very complex case. The scientific and medical evidence was nuanced and in many ways uncertain. But nuance doesn't make for a catchy headline. It was much easier to focus on the emotional, dramatic aspects of the story. The grieving husband, the damning diaries, the shocking number of deaths. The possibility that this could be a medical tragedy was often downplayed or dismissed entirely. The media narrative required a villain, and Kathleen Folbigg was cast in that role. This oversimplification denied the public the chance to understand the full picture, including the significant doubts that existed in the prosecution's case. Ultimately, the trial by media created a legacy of prejudice that followed Kathleen for 2 decades. Even after she was convicted, the media continued to refer to her as a convicted serial killer, reinforcing the public's belief in her guilt. This made the fight for her exoneration even harder. Her supporters were not just battling a legal conviction, they were battling a deeply entrenched public narrative. The Folbigg case serves as a powerful reminder of the media's responsibility. It shows how the rush for a dramatic story can overshadow the search for truth, with devastating consequences for the individuals involved and for the integrity of the justice system itself. Section 5. A case built on doubt. The prosecution's case against Kathleen Folbigg was presented as solid and convincing, but in reality it was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and, well, questionable science. The central claim was that she had smothered all 4 children. However, there was no forensic evidence to support this. Autopsies found no physical signs of asphyxiation, such as bruising or petechia, which are tiny broken blood vessels that can sometimes appear. The children's deaths were, from a purely physical standpoint, unexplained. The prosecution had to build a case without a murder weapon, without a witness, and without a confession, other than the contested interpretations of her diaries. A key part of the prosecution's argument rested on the supposed improbability of 4 natural deaths in one family. They relied on the statistical argument that such an event was astronomically unlikely. This was encapsulated by the now infamous Meadows Law, which suggested that multiple infant deaths in one family point to murder. This principle, however, is not a scientific law at all. It's a discredited theory that ignores the possibility of underlying genetic conditions that can run in families. The jury was told that the odds were 1 in a trillion, a figure that was not based on any rigorous scientific calculation, but was powerful enough to persuade them. Furthermore, the medical testimony presented at the original trial was far from conclusive. While some experts testified that they could not find a natural cause of death, and therefore leaned towards homicide, others were more cautious. The problem was the limit of medical knowledge at the time. In 2003, the field of genetics was not as advanced as it is today. Doctors could not test for many of the rare genetic mutations that are now known to cause cardiac arrest and sudden death in infants. The absence of a known natural cause was treated as evidence of an unnatural one, a logical fallacy that proved to be devastating for Kathleen. The prosecution effectively worked backward from a presumption of guilt. They started with the conclusion that Kathleen had killed her children and then arranged the evidence to fit that narrative. Her diaries were interpreted as confessions, Her lack of outward hysterical grief was seen as the cold demeanor of a killer. The statistical improbability was presented as proof. Each piece of circumstantial evidence on its own was weak, but when woven together by a compelling prosecution story, it created an illusion of certainty. The jury was convinced, but the seeds of doubt were there from the very beginning, waiting for science to catch up. One of the most subtle but powerful forces working against Kathleen Folbigg was how she was judged as a mother. Society holds deep-seated expectations about how a grieving mother should look and act. We expect to see uncontrollable sobbing, public displays of despair, and a person utterly broken by loss. Kathleen did not always fit this stereotype. By all accounts, she was a private person. In public, she often appeared stoic and composed. Her grief was real and profound, but she did not perform it in the way that the public, the media, and maybe even the jury expected. This perceived lack of emotion was interpreted not as a coping mechanism, but as a sign of cold-hearted guilt. This judgment is rooted in a gendered bias that is often applied to women, especially mothers, in the justice system. Mothers are expected to be nurturing, selfless, and endlessly patient. When they express anger, frustration, or ambivalence about motherhood, as Kathleen did in her diaries, it is seen as a shocking deviation from the norm. A father writing about the stress of a crying baby might be seen as relatable. But for a mother, these same feelings are often viewed as unnatural and sinister. Kathleen was judged against an impossible ideal of perfect motherhood, and she was found wanting. Her human flaws were magnified and presented as evidence of monstrosity. The prosecution expertly exploited these societal biases. They contrasted the image of the ideal, weeping mother with the composed figure of Kathleen Folbigg in the courtroom. They suggested that a real mother would never write about her child. "I want to be left alone." They implied that a real mother would be hysterical with grief, not quietly withdrawn. This created a narrative where Kathleen's personality was on trial just as much as the evidence. The jury was invited to ask themselves not just did she do it, but also, is this how a loving mother behaves? This emotional judgment likely played a significant role in their final decision. In retrospect, it is clear that Kathleen's response to trauma was pathologized. Grief is not a uniform experience. People respond to loss in many different ways. Some become withdrawn and numb, a common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Others might try to maintain a sense of normalcy as a way to survive an unbearable reality. To mistake a person's quiet stoicism for a lack of feeling is a profound and dangerous error. In Kathleen Folbigg's case, this misunderstanding of grief contributed to a 2-decade-long injustice. Her story forces us to question our own prejudices and our narrow definitions of what sorrow is supposed to look like. The turning point in the Kathleen Folbigg saga was not a legal argument or a newfound witness. It was a scientific breakthrough buried deep within her own DNA. For years, her supporters had argued that there must be a medical explanation for the children's deaths. In 2018, a new inquiry was opened, and this time science was ready to provide an answer. A team of immunologists and geneticists, led by Professor Carola Vinuesa, sequenced the genomes of Kathleen and her 4 children. They were searching for something that was invisible in 2003 rare genetic mutations that could explain the sudden deaths. What they found would change everything. The scientific team discovered a novel genetic mutation in Kathleen and her 2 daughters, Sarah and Laura. The mutation was in a gene called CALM2. The CALM genes are crucial for regulating calcium in the body, which in turn controls the rhythm of the heartbeat. A mutation in a CALM gene can lead to a condition called calmodulinopathy, which can cause sudden and fatal cardiac arrhythmias. In simple terms, Sarah and Laura had inherited a genetic variant from their mother that could cause their hearts to stop suddenly without any warning. This was the medical explanation that had been missing for so long. It was a plausible, scientific reason for why they had died. This discovery fundamentally undermined the prosecution's case. The argument that it was statistically impossible for 4 children in one family to die of natural causes was shattered. The genetic evidence showed that it was not only possible, but, in the case of the Folbigg family, tragically probable. Further investigation also revealed that the 2 boys, Caleb and Patrick, carried a different rare genetic variant in a gene called BSN. While the link to sudden death was less certain for this gene, it suggested that the boys may also have had an underlying neurological condition that made them vulnerable. The idea of a single unlucky family with multiple genetic problems was no longer a wild theory. It was a scientific reality. The CALM-2 mutation was the smoking gun, but it was a gun that pointed to natural causes, not murder. It explained why the girls had died suddenly without any physical signs of struggle or smothering. It provided a reason for Laura's death, which had been the catalyst for the criminal charges. She had suffered from a mild infection before she died, and scientists know that fevers can be a trigger for fatal cardiac events in people with chole-medullopathy. The science provided a complete alternative narrative to the one presented by the prosecution. It was a story of genetic fate, not a story of maternal malice. The case against Kathleen Folbigg was beginning to crumble. The discovery of the CALM-2 mutation was a scientific triumph, but it did not automatically lead to Kathleen Folbigg's freedom. The legal system is often slow to respond to new scientific evidence, especially when it contradicts a firm conviction. It took an unprecedented campaign from the scientific community to force the issue. In 2021, a petition signed by 90 Australian scientists, including 2 Nobel laureates and a former Australian of the Year, was sent to the Governor of New South Wales. They called for Kathleen's immediate pardon and release, stating that the scientific evidence created an overwhelming case for her innocence. This advocacy was crucial. The scientists did not just present their findings, they explained them in clear, unambiguous terms. They argued that to ignore the genetic evidence would be to let a terrible miscarriage of justice stand. They stated that the medical and pathological evidence presented at her original trial was outdated and, in light of the new discoveries, incorrect. The petition was a powerful statement from some of the nation's brightest minds. It declared that the legal system had made a grave error and that science now offered a path to correct it. This put immense public and political pressure on the government to act. The campaign led to a second inquiry into her convictions. This time, the new genetic evidence was front and center. Dozens of experts from around the world testified about the CALM-2 gene and its known effects. They explained that the mutation found in Sarah and Laura was a reasonably possible cause of their deaths. The evidence was so compelling that it changed the opinion of many who had previously believed in her guilt. The inquiry heard how the original case was built on flawed assumptions and a misunderstanding of medical science. The narrative had completely flipped. The doubt was no longer about her innocence, but about her guilt. Finally, in June 2023, the weight of the scientific evidence became undeniable. The New South Wales Attorney General announced that he had received a summary of the inquiry's findings, which concluded there was reasonable doubt as to Kathleen Folbigg's guilt. He recommended that she be unconditionally pardoned. After 20 years in prison, Kathleen Folbigg walked free. It was a victory for science, a testament to the perseverance of her supporters, and a powerful moment of correction. The scientists had not just discovered a gene, they had used their collective voice to demand justice, and in doing so, had rescued an innocent woman from a life behind bars. Kathleen Folbigg's exoneration is more than just the story of one woman's freedom. It is a profound moment of reckoning for the Australian justice system. Her case exposes the dangers of relying on circumstantial evidence, subjective interpretations, and outdated science. It forces us to confront the reality that wrongful convictions can and do happen. For 2 decades, the system failed her. It failed to properly scrutinize the evidence. It allowed gendered bias to influence judgment, and it was too slow to accept new scientific truths. Her pardon and the quashing of her convictions are an admission of that failure, but the work of reform is just beginning. The case raises critical questions about public accountability. Who is responsible when the system gets it so wrong? There is the role of the media, which sensationalized the case and poisoned public opinion. There is the role of the prosecution, which built a narrative around questionable evidence and psychological speculation. And there is the role of the legal system itself, which upheld the convictions through multiple appeals, even as doubts grew. The Folbigg case should lead to a serious review of how our courts handle complex scientific evidence and how they guard against the influence of public prejudice. It is a call for greater humility and a willingness to admit error. For Kathleen Folbigg, the personal aftermath is complex. 20 years of her life were stolen. She missed seeing her nieces and nephews grow up. She lost her freedom, her reputation, and her chance to grieve for her children in peace. No amount of compensation can ever truly make up for that loss. Her release is not a happy ending, but the beginning of a new, difficult chapter. She must now navigate a world that has changed dramatically, all while carrying the immense weight of her past. Her resilience is extraordinary, but the scars of this injustice will remain with her forever. She is free, but she will never be fully free from what happened. Ultimately, the story of Kathleen Folbigg is a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that truth can be complex and that certainty can be an illusion. It shows the immense power of science to uncover hidden truths and correct our deepest held beliefs. Her case has become a landmark in Australian legal history, a symbol of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice and the long, hard fight for redemption. It stands as a powerful argument for the creation of an independent body to review criminal cases, ensuring that future Kathleen Folbiggs do not have to wait decades for science and justice to finally catch up.